Has anything that popped up? Oh, really? No.
It's 5:30.
Oh, I cannot talk. We completed time.
Yeah. It's just sort of to and show everyone's got the point to get to.
That's great.
And sign up.
Great. What the third?
Presenting
Okay.
this one.
Okay.
The microphone.
Thank you. Where's Kate?
She's upstairs.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. No, it's not. No, it is. Yes, yes, yes.
Yes. Together. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yes.
All right, good evening and welcome to the Friends of the Bioethics Society, esteemed speakers, and the Deputy Vice Chancellor, Prof Morris. And welcome to tonight's informative talk by two NICD specialists, Professor Lucile Blumberg and Dr. Kerrigan McCarthy. My name is Kate De Silva and I'm the chairperson of the WITS Students Bioethics Society. And this is my vice chair, Daniel Abrams. Tonight, I will be the chair of any questions coming from the audience in person, and Daniel will be monitoring our stream online, and he will be chairing those questions coming from that audience. So for those that are joining us on YouTube, please post any questions you might have for our speakers in the comment section. So this evening, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Lucile Blumberg. Prof Blumberg is a highly respected specialist in the field of infectious diseases and is widely recognized for her contribution to sustainable and groundbreaking research and the maintenance of public health. Prof Blumberg was the Deputy Director of the National Institute for Communicable Diseases from 2002 until 2021. She was responsible for establishing the Institute's Division of Public Health, Surveillance and Response, which covers travel medicine and clinical infectious diseases. Prof Blumberg has worked in outbreak response for 20 years at the NICD to reduce morbidity and mortality by measuring the impact on healthcare systems. This is done through correctly identifying vulnerable individuals, as well as identifying strategic interventions to reduce the risk of contracting infections, especially with regards to severe illness. Professor Blumberg's expertise in the management of viral outbreaks is widely sought after and is borne out by her membership of a large number of professional associations and national and international expert groups and committees. Prof Blumberg is currently the consultant at Right to Care, where she focuses on creating a One Health program within RTC, especially for rabies, and on responding to health emergencies in South Africa and its surrounding regions. She's a medical graduate of the University of the Witwatersrand, an associate professor in the Department of Medical Microbiology at the University of Stellenbosch, and a lecturer in the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Pretoria. It also gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Kerrigan McCarthy. Dr. McCarthy is a medical doctor and a clinical microbiologist with a PhD in public health. Dr. McCarthy has 20 years experience working in communicable disease control programs, including TB, HIV, outbreak investigation, and management and surveillance programs. She has spent her professional life supporting public health responses and health system strengthening for communicable diseases. Since 2015, she has worked at the NICD supporting national government responses to communicable disease outbreaks, including the listeriosis outbreak in 2017 to 2018. Most recently, she has provided technical support for COVID-related public health responses at a national and provincial level. Dr. McCarthy has also been actively involved in the Anglican Church for several years. She serves as a lay minister at the St. Thomas in London and obtained an MPhil in theology with courses in human dignity and moral philosophy from St. Augustine's College in London in 2012. For 15 years, from 2002, she worked with a team at Nazareth House in the city of Johannesburg to provide antiretroviral therapy and hospice care. Prof and Dr. McCarthy, thank you so much for making time in your busy schedule to be with us tonight. We are very privileged to have you speak, share your experience and knowledge with us tonight.
Yes.
So good evening, everybody. It's lovely to see you in person, and good evening to those online. So thanks to you very much, Kate, for a very generous introduction and for the invitation to be here. I think this meeting is perfectly timed, given the declaration on Saturday of a public health emergency of international concern. So we're going to do a two-hander tonight. I'm going to present the background to monkeypox, the current outbreak, and some of the interventions that have been recommended. Speak a little bit about the public health emergency. It's a good thing, it's a bad thing. Then Kerrigan will present a framework around public health, ethics, all the right words, Kerrigan, and then we'll open it up for discussion. I think there are a number of questions. We don't have all the answers, and it would be really lovely to have your inputs. So we hope to have a nice interaction session. Thanks very much. So Saturday, the WHO declared monkeypox to be a public health emergency of international concern. That's the highest level declaration of a health risk. It came after, I think, quite a difficult meeting. The committee, who are all experts in the field, there was not a unanimous decision. People thought there were advantages of declaring a public health emergency, and others thought there would be disadvantages, and we can discuss some of those later. This fate comes on the top of COVID, which is still with us, and that has not been rescinded. So it's an extra burden to public health programs. The fate criteria were met. This is an unusual or unexpected event. Monkeypox has been really endemic in Western and Central Africa, but has now emerged in new communities in other countries. It's spreading quite quickly. From the first meeting just 4 weeks before, there's been a massive increase. Now over almost 15,000 cases of suspected or confirmed monkeypox, and there may be many others that we are not diagnosing in 72 countries. The majority of the cases are no longer in Africa, but really mainly in parts of Europe, in North America, and a couple of other countries. The risk assessment, though, is considered, while it's high in the European region, it's probably moderate at a global level and quite low in many other countries. So I think that's just to bear that in mind. So a little background on smallpox viruses. I think most of you came after the smallpox pandemic or outbreak. I do remember receiving the vaccine with that horrible bifurcated needle. But it's a great success of public health. And smallpox is only one of 2 diseases that have been eradicated ever, means off the face of the earth. The one is rinderpest, which is an animal disease, and then smallpox. And the reason it was able to be eradicated was there's no animal reservoir. It's only in humans. There was a highly effective vaccine. There was coordinated efforts to reach all communities, and there was very visible disease. And it was a disease with high morbidity and a significant mortality. There were a number of deaths, and a number of people with severe illness. Smallpox vaccine is in fact one of the oldest ones. It's a very famous painting of Jenner, who's a very famous name in history of immunization. We noticed that milkmaids didn't get severe smallpox, and it was probably the vaccinia virus that they were inoculated with because of their association with the animals that reduced the risk of severe disease. So that was the basis of the smallpox vaccine that he developed. So this went on to a really concerted global effort, and in 1979, smallpox was declared eradicated. In fact, it came 3 years after the last case, and that is Ali. He was a cook in Somalia, and he's the last documented case. Very sad story later. Ali went on to help with polio campaigns and died of malaria in Africa. Really not a great outcome. So smallpox vaccine, the global repositories of smallpox virus were destroyed. But smallpox vaccine was maintained. in case there was a problem in the future. And the capacity to produce it was still retained. And in fact, there was a global stockpile. It was given to American soldiers going to war, and there was always a concern that smallpox would be one of the bioweapons. So, I think there was some vested interests. But it's alive, it's attenuated, but it's a live vaccinia virus. It had lots of side effects. You couldn't give it to HIV, or which wasn't a big problem in those days, or immunocompromised patients because they could get disseminated vaccinia, and you couldn't give it to those who had allergic skin problems because they would get quite severe illness. But what it did do was, it obviously was important in control of smallpox, but it provided cross protection against monkeypox. So if you were born before the 1970s, and I think none of you were, you got smallpox vaccine, and you would have some protection, but it's obviously waned over time. And people who are living in endemic areas for what became monkeypox were immunized, and that might have given them some cross protection against monkeypox, but that is waned. So what about monkeypox? So it belongs to the same orthopox viruses as smallpox. It's definitely an emerging zoonosis, so it's kind of changing and increasing and extending its regional geographic reach. But it's been around for a long time, and it's endemic in West and Central. And you can see the map on the bottom, the countries where it is endemic. So Nigeria, Central African Republic, the DRC, and there are 3 different forms of the virus. The West African one is probably less severe, causes less severe illness. The one in Central Africa causes more severe illness. But overall, a fairly low mortality. The name monkeypox is another sort of ethical issue, and I know there's probably a committee as we sit here thinking, should we change the name because it stigmatizes monkeys? Because monkeys were not the reservoir. Monkeypox did not come from monkeys. It was first identified in 1958 in a laboratory, in imported laboratory monkeys from Africa. But it's not where it comes from originally. The first human case was in the Congo Basin in 1970. Some years later, there have been a couple of outbreaks related to imported animals. There was quite a big one in the United States related to important prairie dogs. They're not dogs, they're actually rodents that were exported to America and sold as pets. So there was an outbreak there. But the actual reservoir of human infection is unknown. It's probably a rodent. And it's a rodent in a rainforest in the countries that I've mentioned. A number of animals do get infected from the rodents, non-human primates, squirrels, other sorts of rodents. And transmission in this area is from animal to human or human to human, all through contaminated materials. These DNA viruses are kind of quite long-lasting in the environment. You get skins, scales, that you can come in contact with. But mostly it's contact with infected animals. There's a big bushmeat trade. So people go into the forest, they do catch rodents, they catch non-human primates. That's a picture from a market in the DRC. And they may be infected, and then they're transmitted to humans. And then human to human, in this setting, is through respiratory secretions or direct contact with vesicles, skin to skin. But it's very different to what we're seeing now. Probably a few hundred cases every year in these areas, not well documented, no access to diagnostics. Obviously, there's no treatment, and vaccination is not part of any strategy. And perhaps it's an increase or better surveillance, better documentation, but people are moving into the forest a lot more in search of food. Forests are being cut down, and all of this might lead to what we're seeing as an increase in emerging zoonotic diseases, including monkeypox. So mortality rate depends. West Africans about 1%, the Central African about 10%, can see severe disease, mainly in children, pregnant women, and the focus of the cases is really, depending on where you are, on younger people. I think we've mentioned that, and that's the classical monkeypox. Looks very much like smallpox, and you can see the classical vesicles, all at the same stage. The lesions all at the same stage of development. You get a flat lesion, and you get a vesicle, they scab, and when they fall off, they do leave a scar, and they last probably about 1 to 3 weeks. So what about the current outbreak? So that's an ongoing outbreak in an endemic area, and we've had that for a long time. From time to time, there are people who visit Nigeria, and there are occasional imported cases of monkeypox. They've been documented for several years in the United Kingdom, but really they identify them quickly. It's not easily spread in a household, and it's contained. But in May this year, things changed. So the first case was an imported case from Nigeria, but by May the 16th, they identified several other cases that were not linked to this first one. And they did quite extensive investigations, but they couldn't find any apparent link. But by the 22nd of July, this is the picture that I've mentioned. And I think most of you know that South Africa's had 3 cases, and we'll talk about those a bit later. So there have been several publications on what does it look like, who are the group infected, and how do we recognize it. So my last month has been spent responding to monkeypox, which I must tell you has been chickenpox. People who work in clinical medicine and patients seem to have forgotten many of the common dermatological diseases, and chickenpox, I think, has been probably the most important one. So this is a very important, I think, very detailed clinical paper in the NHLS last week, put together reports from 43 countries, 528 infections, and some of the key features. So almost all the cases were in gay or bisexual men, men who had sex with men, and very few in other groups, a few women who had close contact. And we've seen now about 2 or 3 cases in children where there's no definite exposure that anybody can identify, but it may be a household where there are scales. Of this group, 41% had HIV, most were on antiretrovirals, and were reasonably well. Young, many had multiple partners, and many had attended some recent events, gay pride events. Rash was very common, and different to the outbreak in the DRC, where there were mostly facial lesions on the arm or palms and soles. Many had anogenital lesions. Some were very, there were multiple lesions, but some had very few lesions that would be hard to recognize. So identifying patients and saying, well, you should isolate becomes quite a challenge. In many cases, the classical prodrome of fever, lethargy, headache was present after the rash, and some were present before, and incubation periods were very, very variable. Some were quite short, and some were quite long. So, quite a few challenges there, particularly in recognizing the clinical picture. And whereas monkeypox in the DRC, you see the lesions at all the same stage of development, so quite easy to recognize. In monkeypox in non-endemic areas, the lesions are quite different. And then you see different stages of the lesion in one patient at the same time, and there's one of the examples. So this is perhaps worth reading. It's a report from somebody who actually had monkeypox. He published it in The Guardian, he shared his pictures, and he shared his story. He obviously had quite severe disease, and unlike most of the cases in the DRC, the have been a number of patients with more severe disease, but morbidity, not mortality, and nobody has died. There have been 5 deaths in Nigeria and the DRC. And it's been mainly pain. And as opposed to the lesions on the skin, of the arms or the face, they've had rectal lesions. So there's been severe proctitis. And he describes the hell of having the pain in very sensitive areas. And then he also describes, I think, and it's really, I think, worth reading, his view on, pretty worried this is going to be another endemic disease, especially among gay people. He describes his challenges about getting a diagnosis. In New York, there were only, at this stage of the outbreak, there were only 3 places you could get a test. He describes the sort of approach from the health authorities to informing him about his diagnosis, which I think he knew already, about helping him or not helping him through the isolation, not helping him to get access to treatment. It's a pretty dismal account of this person and probably many other people's experience of, this outbreak in July. It's already several months into the outbreak. So what can you do? What do we need? And in the WHO, IHR declaration of a pandemic, there are very clear recommendations about access to diagnosis, access to treatment, and possible interventions for control. So currently there's only PCR, which you can only get in certain centers. But as we saw with COVID, you quite quickly develop rapid tests. And you can only, many things look the same. So diagnosis is very important if you want to put interventions in place. Most of the diseases in the West, Western high-income countries, but what about others? There are certain, there's a group of drugs that were developed for smallpox that have been shown to have some effects in treatment. Again, very limited availability, reasonably safe, and reasonably effective. And it's been made available through various means in the United States, a couple of other countries, to patients who are hospitalized. And he described responding very well to ticagrelor. But what about places where it's not been, you have to, the regulatory authorities have not passed it, it's not available, there's limited supplies, I think we need to consider that. And then, most importantly, vaccines. There's been a lot of modeling done very recently to look at what would be the most important interventions to stop this outbreak from moving along. And vaccines are the most important. And we need to look at strategies. So there are 2 vaccines available. They both have been used for smallpox. The old-fashioned one, which we all got, was related to the first generation of this vaccine, but it's live vaccinia virus, it's ACAM 4000. There's lots of supplies of it, but it's replicating, and you cannot use it in persons who've got immune problems or who've got skin problems. If you inject it, you've got to cover it. You can't have a household with somebody who's got immune problems, because they can also actually get infected and affected. So the only vaccine we have at the moment is the Jynneos one, very limited supplies, not registered in most countries, has been registered in the United States and perhaps 1 or 2 others. It's made in Scandinavia. It's live. It's a first live, non-replicating, so it's safe. You can use it, and it certainly prevents smallpox. And in limited studies, has been shown to be effective against monkeypox. So limited. So what are we going to do about this disease? We have an expanding epidemic, now a public health emergency. We have a disease with a low mortality, but a high morbidity. We have a disease that is moderately easy to transmit, and in some settings quite low. It's not COVID where you're in the same room and contract it. You really need direct contact with those who've got it. But in these settings, these close sexual networks, social networks, a lot of anonymous sex. We don't really have a good idea of what is going on, but there's opportunities there. And some people have very few organisms, and some have very few skin lesions, and some of them in places that are not easily visible. So close direct contact with skin lesions is the major mode of transmission. It's not been shown yet to be sexually transmitted. It has been found in semen, but there's not enough evidence to date that it's sexually transmitted. And we don't know anything about asymptomatic transmission spread. So the incubation periods are quite long. And before they have skin lesions, can they spread it? And that's something we don't know. But there are lots of unknowns. So what can we do? So the first strategy, remember about COVID, you would identify a case and isolate. Well, if you don't have a test, that's quite difficult to do. There's a lot of stigma attached to presenting, quite a lot of diagnostic dilemmas, Monkey Pox versus many others, atypical lesions. So you've got to identify cases, and that's not easy. And then there's a strategy to follow up contacts. Well, many people don't know who their contacts are, or don't want to share them. And I think that's proven quite challenging. So I think isolation and follow up of contacts, as we try to do for COVID, is really not going to work. So what about vaccination? So there are two strategies. The first one that was suggested was post-exposure. So identifying contacts of patients and vaccinating them within 4 days. Well, if you don't know who the contacts are, nobody's sharing them, or they don't even know who they are, it's really quite difficult to do that. And do you have enough vaccine? And does the strategy work? I don't think we even know that. So I think they've moved now to pre-exposure prophylaxis for high-risk groups. Again, the efficacy is unknown in outbreak control. Vaccines seem to be safe. Major problems of access. All the vaccines are, in a small number of countries. How much coverage do you require to break the chain of transmission? And how do you identify all the at-risk people? So at the moment, it's they're vaccinating in only a small number of countries, mostly in the United States, some in Europe, some in the UK. Those healthcare workers who are working in high-risk settings, HIV-infected persons, people who identify as a risk group. And I think the uptake is very good, but the amount of vaccine is absolutely not. So this raises the question of equity in vaccine. All of our COVID vaccines and equity reached most of the world quite late, certainly Africa. So I think it raises that as an ethical question. And then, most importantly, reaching communities who are at risk and making them part of communications and strategies, not top-down approach. So I'm going to hand over to Kerrigan now, just to formalize this, and then we're going to open a number of ethical questions for your input and your discussion.
So good evening, everybody, and thank you to the organisers, but more especially thank you to Lucile for the opportunity to share the platform with you. So Lucile was standing in this position, and I was in your seats many years ago when I was a medical student. And the reason I became enthralled with communicable diseases was because of Lucile's inspiration. So how lovely it is to be here today. So yes, sure, it's good that we know the science, and it's even more helpful to understand, to have an ethical framework before we even try and put all of that science and that confusing amount of ethical dilemmas that are raised by monkeypox into a framework. And so how are we going to do that? Where is the page down? Right. So we are going to talk about, when I see I didn't finish my slides properly, we're going to talk about ethical principles in individual patient care, and then we're going to look at the ethics of public health, and we're going to find draw from that an ethical framework to support probably in the public health space. So because you are members of the WITS Bioethics Society, I take it as a given that you are familiar with the ethical principles that were formed during the duration of Helsinki, and those are beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, and autonomy. And essentially, as a healthcare practitioner, we should always act in the best interests of our patients. We should do no harm. We should act with justice and fairly, and we should respect the free will of our patients. And we can use this ethical framework to address problems of individual patient care. Of course, those of us who have done courses in good clinical practice will realize that these principles guide us in a number of issues. So, for example, if we're doing an experimental treatment of an experimental, an experiment of a new development treatment, we will want to make sure that we in the choice of our placebo or our control group, that we provide the most appropriate care, that our intervention does no harm, that the balance of good versus harm is met, that we retain confidentiality, and that we give informed consent. And of course, these are all part and parcel of the way we are taught to treat and to care for our patients. So what I never understood as a medical student was the relationship between these principles, the four principles that I've outlined above, and the many ethical frameworks that come our way. What essentially I've come to understand of applying a different value to these four goods: the good of beneficence, the good of non-maleficence, the good of autonomy, and the good of justice. So you will have heard of utilitarianism as expressed in the form of the end justifies the means. But essentially what a person is saying is that the good of the end result, in other words, the justice, the non-maleficence, the beneficence, and the autonomy of the outcome outweighs the good, that's the justice, the autonomy, the beneficence, and the non-maleficence of the means. And so the weighting of those different ethical principles is held in tension with each other, and a utilitarian perspective will say that, yes, I value all of these goods, but I value them more in the outcome as opposed to in the means. If we look, for example, at deontologism, this talks about almost the opposite of utilitarianism. So a person who is a deontologist or who's operating out of deontological principles will say that the good of the means that we use to achieve the outcome or the intervention outweighs the good of the outcome. So the classic ethical story of the person housing or hiding a Jew from the Gestapo in the Second World War, and when that person is confronted by the SS officer standing at the door of their house and saying, "Are you hiding Jews in the basement?" the deontologist will say, yes, because the deontologist believes that the good of the means outweighs the good of the outcome, and truth is always best. So a famous person called Immanuel Kant was a deontologist. He believed that no matter what, you should always do good. Whereas the utilitarian will say, no, I don't have any Jews in the basement. And they will, because they believe that the good of the outcome outweighs the good of the means. And so you can see how these different ethical principles are weighed in tension. An ethical principle or framework that we see in operation in South Africa a lot is something called contractualism. And this approach says that the right way is to follow the procedures regardless of the outcome. In other words, the good of the procedures outweighs the good of the outcome. And so someone who follows the rules will say, I can't do anything about this case of measles because it hasn't been notified yet to the authorities. Whereas a person who is a utilitarian will say, goodness me, this is a case of measles, I better let this person be isolated and make appropriate interventions. I'll inform the authorities later. Okay. And another way of approaching ethical problems is a framework called communitarianism. And this holds the good of the community over and above the principles of justice, autonomy, and non-maleficence for the community. The good of the community, the beneficence of the community, outweighs the justice and autonomy and non-maleficence. And so a person who has a communitarian outlook on life will regard the needs of the community over and above the needs of justice, autonomy. And many traditional cultures and communities have an outlook based in a communitarianist framework. Almost on the contrary to this is the individualism or the liberalism approach, where a liberalist approach is when an individual or a community will hold the value of autonomy, of individual autonomy, over and above the good of beneficence or non-maleficence or justice. So, for example, the debate in the southern United States around wearing masks and the mandatory wearing of masks is perceived as a curtailment of an individual freedom or liberty. But it was held above the value of decreased transmission of COVID. And so a libertarian approach would say, I won't wear a mask because it curtails my own freedom. It's a mandate that eliminates choice, and I hold individual autonomy over and above the good of others and justice and autonomy, justice and non-maleficence. An egalitarianist framework believes that all persons should be treated the same. In other words, they hold justice above beneficence or non-maleficence or autonomy. And so a person who has an egalitarian framework may sometimes say that or lead to injustice being done, or at least harm being done, because they believe that justice outweighs and trumps all other goods. So with that in mind, how do we look at public health? Well, it's a relatively easy matter to hold these four goods in tension when we're faced with an individual in front of us. But how is it that we can use these principles when we're dealing with populations is another matter altogether. And the reason for this is that there is a simplistic reduction of the complexities of ethical questions when we hold a very simple health utilitarian outlook. In other words, if we say to do the greatest good for the most people, we are and we say it doesn't matter what the means are. In other words, we hold the good of the greatest number of people over and above the good, or over and above the good of individuals or autonomy or justice, we might land up doing harm. And so it is a very simplistic approach to say that the proper goal of public health is to advance the health of as many people as possible, because inevitably we land up in public health violating our principles of beneficence, justice, autonomy, and non-maleficence. So, for example, isolation and quarantine infringes on the movements of people. Surveillance infringes on justice because it erodes confidentiality. If we have to involuntarily examine and test people, we infringe on their autonomy and their right to bodily integrity. So essentially, the actions that impinge on individual liberty bring about public good, and collectively applied, the public good can also be known as human rights. So when we try to apply and implement public health principles, we're going to erode human rights. And aren't we supposed to uphold human rights as a part of Section 27 of our Constitution? And so we land up in the catch-22. Now, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of the United Nations allows the public good to take precedence over individual rights in various situations where there are threats to public health. But at the same time, upholding human rights is essential to maintaining both public trust and public cooperation in the fight against communicable diseases. And so how do we balance these two seemingly conflicting viewpoints? Ethicists have argued that we can override beneficence, justice, autonomy, and non-maleficence if we fulfill certain principles. And these principles are listed here. Number one, scientific validity. The containment measures should be scientifically justifiable, if not validated or evidence-based. There should be a biological basis for the intervention that we impose or propose. Harm versus injury. There should be a clear and measurable harm to others should the illness go unchecked. The principle of proportionality, or least restrictive means, says that the containment measures that we implement should be those that impact least on human rights, and that the impact on human rights should be conversely proportional to the potential threat. The principle of reciprocity means that we should provide reciprocal benefits in exchange for asking people to curtail their individual liberties. Officials in making decisions should be transparent. They should have an obligation to communicate clearly their justification for their actions, and there should be a process of appeal. There should be no discrimination made amongst peoples or groups, and no persons or groups should be singled out in a way as to cause an adverse impact. With regard to justice, equity, and participation, populations that are affected most should be supported most and consulted firstly. And privacy and informed consent should be upheld within the confines of the intervention. So I can see your brains are ticking over with the information that Lucile has provided about monkeypox and how these interventions that we can provide to curtail the transmission of monkeypox should be carefully thought through. Now, the Nuffield Council of Bioethics has proposed what they call the intervention ladder, which is a helpful guide as to the proportionality principle that we see in public health. And remember, the proportionality principle is the principle that says that the intervention or the curtailment of freedom caused by the intervention should be proportional to the harm or to the threat. And so, for example, it may be ethically justifiable to eliminate choice in certain circumstances where the threat is enormous. But it may not be appropriate to eliminate choice of an individual if the harm is minuscule or the consequences are low. So if we take, for example, the problem of mandatory vaccination, should we make vaccination mandatory? We are given the options, guided to the option through the Nuffield Council of Bioethics intervention ladder, and we can play with ideas that allow us to explore the different range of options that we have in response to curtailment of freedoms by an intervention. So were we to choose to make vaccination mandatory, we would be eliminating choice right at the top of the ladder. But are there other ways that we can bring about an increase in vaccination coverage that would allow the population to be safe, that need not curtail an individual's freedom? So we could restrict choice by, for example, restricting the use of healthcare services or education to people who can show proof of vaccination. We can incentivize choice by providing cash transfers for proof of vaccination. We can enable choice by offering everybody vaccination and then requiring some kind of discussion to refuse. We can provide information by training healthcare workers to deal with vaccine hesitancy and understand the concerns of persons who are vacillating around vaccination. We can monitor vaccination coverage rates, and at the very least, we can do nothing. And so this intervention ladder is a helpful tool. So let's talk. I have a few questions to start us off. I think Lucile needs to come up.
Okay.
Because the first is the principle of scientific validity. And so Lucile is our reference person and is going to help us address some of these questions. So, that's not working. There are 4 ethical questions that we're going to address. And the first is that the name monkeypox should be changed. So let's have a bit of a conversation about the name. In fact, let's rather, I don't know, what do you think, Lucile? You mentioned this in your talk.
Yeah, I think it stigmatizes unfairly monkeys.
Monkeys?
Well, yes, it doesn't come from monkeys.
Okay.
So that's how I know.
So monkeypox has been known as monkeypox for
Many
generations,
years.
and nobody complained about it being stigmatizing before, did they? So
No.
here's a quote, Lucile, that comes from a it proposes a neutral term like what?
Exactly. Little h MPX3.
So Lucile, tell us about the conventions around naming viruses.
Well, we have a virologist in the audience. Lynn, over to you.
Well, I mean, there's no kind of standard on these things. I mean, as you can see, I mean, that's unpronounceable. So I'm not quite sure what they, how they're going to refer to that. Unless they say, the virus formerly known as monkeypox, But, I mean, we went through this with COVID, obviously.
Yeah. And then we went
The whole
through the Greek
renaming.
alphabet.
And then we went through the Greek
I
alphabet, which actually did work quite well, I think.
Lynn, I thought that the COVID virus was initially nCoV, new coronavirus,
Yeah.
and it was renamed to SARS-CoV-2 because of the International Committee of Standardization of Virological Names. So surely that should be
So I
okay.
guess because there was SARS, there was original SARS, so then I guess they just continued it, I guess. Because
But if
there
you
might
take-
be SARS-CoV-3, right? So
Yeah.
yeah.
It's easy. So if you take Marburg and Ebola, which are the filoviruses, they were named after the towns or the rivers where they were discovered. And then people have moved away from that because it stigmatizes the place. And when we had the new viral hemorrhagic fever from Lusaka in 2009, they decided against calling it the Lusaka and or the Johannesburg virus, where we had 4 cases. And they just made up the name Lude, the next case. So it's a bit of make-up as well.
Yeah, it is a bit of
And
makeup.
nobody's objective.
I mean, I think this is unworkable. This,
Yeah,
how would you say that? NPXP.
that's some mathematical modeling.
Yeah.
Anyway, think about that. I don't have an answer.
Okay, so we could think about it using this framework, and this is a relatively simple problem. Hey, you agree? Why is it a simple problem? Because the consequences are not as damaging from a health perspective and a public health perspective as some of the other problems that we're going to take. But stigma is an enormous problem, okay? And the name monkeypox itself, as we have shared, might be stigmatizing to Africans, but it is stigmatizing to the person with the monkeypox, for sure, isn't it? I mean, I wouldn't like to have a disease, a sexually transmitted infection called monkeypox. It would make me feel less than, hey? So how do we approach this? And I think the principles are the ones that we're going to want to look at. If we rename monkeypox, we will avert some harm and injury, and so we fulfill that criteria of public health. if we look at the consequences of retaining a stigmatizing name, the renaming is a really minor event. It will cause no harm to anyone to rename monkeypox, except for those scientists who say, but we always used to call it monkeypox. Okay? It will definitely reduce discrimination. What about reciprocity? I can't see that there's any reciprocity in this case, so it doesn't necessarily lead to problems. Privacy and informed consent, there's really no one to consult around privacy and informed consent. Scientific validity is where I put a question mark. We need to come up with some kind of name that has some kind of purpose, hey? Meaning, yeah. And transparency, well, it would be good to know what who's being consulted and how the process is unfolding at the WHO, rather than to be informed by the ivory tower that the name has now been changed. And what about participation, justice and equity? What about people who are infected? Are they participating in the changing of the name? So you get the picture, hey? This is how to use the framework. And I think what's very important to remember in approaching an ethical problem is that there is no right or wrong answer. There is, ultimately, we need to find a balance of infringements of personal liberties and population liberties and goods versus the good of the intervention. So, this next principle, or at least issue, is that monkeypox should be a notifiable condition. So let's talk about that for a while. What do you think about that, Lucile?
So by making it a notifiable condition, you can measure, you can see who's being infected, and you can focus your interventions. But I think there are many disadvantages. So currently, all cases are notifiable to the WHO. So it gives an idea of where the outbreak's going and whether they should act. Certainly they have. In South Africa, it has been identified as a need to be a notifiable condition, but it's not yet gazetted. So currently, because we only have one lab doing the testing, it's kind of notifiable.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any thoughts from the audience? Daniel and Kate, do you want to moderate some questions or conversation about this?
Are there any questions?
Comments?
I mean, I don't have a question, but given that at this point, the vast majority of cases have been in the LGBTQ community, I don't know, I just see like HIV.
This is HIV all over again. Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it being.
It will discourage people because it's a mild disease. Many people know what it looks like.
Yeah.
It's self-limiting in most cases, and for most cases, you don't need treatment.
Yeah.
So have it all notified.
Yeah.
And it will discourage people from presenting and being diagnosed and managed.
Yeah.
I think it's helpful to make it notified. I don't know about notifying to the WHO. I think that notifying to the national agency is probably fine.
So currently it's notified to the WHO because they had to make decisions about, should it be declared this?
Going forward, but I don't think notifying should be a big barrier. So usually when you notify, you have to do an enhanced surveillance questionnaire and that kind of thing. And I think those questions shouldn't be compulsory. So if the person doesn't want to answer them, because otherwise it will be very intimidating when they come to consultation.
So, how do communicable diseases get controlled? They become controlled through interventions that cost money. Lucile, how much did the COVID vaccine creation take? How much cash?
Lots. But it happened. And if you can only manage a problem if you can measure it.
Exactly, it happened because we knew how many people were dying from COVID.
And who was, and you could focus your intervention appropriately.
So if you don't know how many people have got monkeypox, we're never going to raise money to make a vaccine for monkeypox. Because the big donors in the world are going to say, well, how many cases are there? And no one's going to know. So to address this problem, the WHO has created some principles, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but they give us some principles on what to do in this exact circumstance, where we need the surveillance data, but we also have to be careful of infringing an individual's autonomy and a community's autonomy, and we have to avoid stigmatizing. And so these principles can guide us in how to do that, or at least what to watch out for. But the implementation on the ground is something that we as public health custodians need to have an eye out for. So let's go on to that one, and I'm not really sure where those questions are supposed to go. The next one is that vaccination against monkeypox should be freely available. Vaccination against monkeypox should be freely available. What do you think about that, Lucile?
So we have a safe vaccine, the Genius one, it's 2 doses, 4 weeks apart, and it's said to be effective 2 weeks after your second dose. And it is effective against smallpox, and it's shown in some studies to be effective in reducing the risk of contracting monkeypox, but certainly severity. It's safe, it's quite expensive, but many vaccines start off as being expensive, and as production is upscaled and others come in, costs can be reduced. And it's reasonably easily administered. You don't need that funny little stick that we used to use. So yes, I do. So it can reduce the risks of monkeypox in an exposed person. Can it stop the outbreak? And I think that's the big question. So there's the individual, and then there's the outbreak. And you will have to reach a certain number of people to ensure that you are reducing. We don't even know if it reduces transmission. This is the incubation period or whatever. But how many people do you have to reach that may be infected to stop, the transmission? We don't know that. So we don't know its role in outbreaks. We know its role in individual illness, and that's a good reason to make it available. And we've got a vaccine that's safe, effective. We can sort out the costs. The availability is a problem, the equity. So, a few rich countries, they're looking at different strategies, reducing the dose that's administered and only going with 1 dose. So that's an ongoing maybe. So,
Any comments?
you've got to identify the at-risk community. We are not going to be able to vaccinate broadly, and should we?
Daniel?
Oh, sorry. Who would you vaccinate?
Yeah, so I was basically going to ask, essentially, because certain population groups are at risk, surely this becomes an issue of using it as a weapon against those communities, especially because it's a community like the LGBTQ plus community can imagine as a sort of discriminatory tool. You can choose not to vaccinate, as well as then certainly, surely it puts, if it's not freely available, surely it puts certain classes of people and certain groups of people at a greater risk. And it's obviously unethical because you have the rich getting vaccinated and those who cannot afford it not getting vaccinated.
So there's an equity issue that's, I think applies to most new vaccines, but it's a major one. And then there's a discriminatory one, but you want to focus on those who are most at risk, currently identified. I think it's very clear who are contracting monkeypox.
So this doesn't directly link to the ethical question, but more vaccine type question. Is there a reason why, because South Africa, I think recently we have vaccine producing capabilities. Is there a reason why, other countries around the world that have the capacity, why they're just not allowed to produce their own vaccines? Why is it that we have to wait to get vaccines from other countries? And obviously it was a problem during COVID as well, because we all kind of just sat with our twiddling our thumbs, and everyone else was getting second and third doses in some places, and we haven't had anything. So is there like a reason, or is it just politics, or what's the?
So I think there are many issues that you are addressing there. So this vaccine wasn't widely used before. So it was one company that did it. There wasn't a lot of use. There wasn't a market for it. And that goes for many of these emerging diseases. There's no market, there's no money, but so there wasn't a market. Monkey pox was confined to the forest, and there weren't many cases. And then there was just some use for army personnel who went to whatever. So there wasn't. So other companies have not come in. Now this has become a much bigger problem. That has to be diversified into other producers. I think that's currently happening, but it's slow. There's trade, those trade things that you.
Well, I was going to say, I'm pretty sure that the mRNA people will be onto
Oh,
this.
very busy.
The kind of the plan for any, outbreaks or new zoonoses or whatever is that you can have a vaccine within 100 days.
Yeah.
So
So
you've got the
platforms
sequence, it's
can do it.
so I think the mRNA technology really opens up a lot of opportunities. And I think you probably all know that South Africa's one of the tech transfer hubs for mRNA. And in fact, right here at Wits, Patrick Arbuthnot's lab is doing that. So I think it does open up a lot of possibilities. But of course, it's still got to be tested.
Yeah.
So we got lucky with COVID. It's not assumed that you can make a vaccine against any virus. But
so it's very important that when you do have a new outbreak or perhaps an old or a new disease, and you introduce an intervention, treatment or vaccine, that you do study it properly.
Yeah.
You really do need to have. It happened with Ebola. And, it was very successful, but you have to study it properly.
So then,
well, I wanted to ask. So is there evidence that if you still got smallpox immunity that you are protected? So is it this affecting?
So
younger
we're 40
people?
years on then.
Yeah, but is it in the younger group?
So the population who are currently infected are average age is about 38, 40.
Yeah.
But that might just be the risk group who are
Right.
being,
And then
where it's being
the HIV, that
transmitted.
seems very high. Is HIV predisposing people to?
So HIV, so that the pox virus is an important part of the immune response is cell-mediated immunity. Yeah, but I think it's the group where it's being transmitted.
So
But there's lots we don't know about the transmission dynamics. Is it a sexually transmitted infection? Don't know.
so this is a lovely segue into an anecdote. Let's go into it. So you all remember 2020, June, when the Lancet published an article about the use of chloroquine during the COVID pandemic. And it caused an absolute furor because Lancet retracted the study, even though the conclusion was that chloroquine was not associated with survival because of uncertainty around the data sources. So the database from which the conclusions of the study were based was never released into the public. And part of the convention around publishing scientific articles today is that you make your data source available, okay? Now, what was the withdrawal of that paper did it have? Well, it led the denialists, the COVID denialists and the anti-vaxxers and the conspiracy theorists to cast aspersions on all scientific findings. It did us an immense disservice. And why? What were the consequences? Well, it was failure, well, the root cause was failure to uphold ethical principles in public health research during a pandemic, okay? And there was another paper that was published, to my absolute horror, by a journal with a relatively low impact factor, but one that receives quite a bit of attention, that said
that in, when was it? June 2021, the safety of COVID vaccines, we should rethink policy. And it was fundamentally flawed in its methodology. They looked at adverse effect reports and they said that there were so many deaths in the adverse effect reports and therefore the vaccine caused the death without understanding the principles underlying causality assessments. Well, you can imagine the anti-vaxxers had a field day. And the principle here was failure to uphold scientific validity and rigorous scientific review by the writers themselves and by the editors of the journal. The article was retracted, but the damage was done. There were accusations of a cover-up and of censorship of peer-reviewed journals. And so, when we're talking about an experimental vaccine that should be made available to the public, Lynn's point is absolutely correct. And Lucile's as well. We have to research, we have to show due diligence in our assessment of the scientific merits and meritworthiness of this vaccine before we make it available to the public. Okay. And again, the Nuffield Council of Bioethics has provided a conceptual framework to assist us with research during a pandemic. And I'm not going to go into them now, but it's a helpful framework for and can serve as a reference point for us. So if we look at this vaccine, should it be freely available? Well, do we meet reciprocity? Does it meet principles of scientific validity? What about harm and injury? Is the risk of getting monkeypox so great that we can use an untried or untested vaccine on the public and allow people to choose for themselves whether they want to take this vaccine? What about transparency? Who made this decision? What data sources did they use? Were affected persons involved in the decision making? What about privacy and informed consent and discrimination? My word, it's a minefield, hey, but it gives us a sense of where the things that we need to look at.
So before you go, come to you, Kate, there's two issues about the vaccine. And I absolutely agree with you about upscaling production. That's something we need to be prepared for future outbreaks, not this one. We can't just have one place doing things. It's the protection of the person, and it's the reduction of transmission so that you can bring the outbreak to an end. And I think there are reflections on HIV. If we had a vaccine early on, could we have stopped where we are now? So there's two separate issues. It's safe for the individual, it does work, but what sort of coverage do you need to stop this outbreak from growing?
Right.
And the second one, we don't know.
Right.
And how do you, that's where you have to make it compulsory or reach all of those who are at risk of developing monkeypox, or I don't know.
So there would be no justification then to make receipt of a monkeypox vaccine mandatory for all citizens. Why? Because the public health impact is unknown. So we don't yet know, for example, what the reproductive number of monkeypox is, how many secondary cases arise from a single, and it must be low.
It's less than
We
one.
don't yet know whether or not there's a public health benefit to having a vaccine. We know that it will help the individual, but we don't know that it will assist in the public health control of the disease. So when it comes to questions of enforced vaccination, we can definitely rule that out as a possibility. When it comes to managing an individual patient, that's when we want to look at these principles of beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, and autonomy. And should an individual be counseled to know that the vaccine is available, identify themselves as being a member of an at-risk group, and therefore elect to take the vaccine, or should it be prescribed compulsory? Question? Comment?
It's more like a comment, but I feel like it should be counseled. If you think about people who get HIV, it's a bit extreme, but HIV example, if they're getting tested, they're getting counseled about getting tested. And I feel like this is sexually transmitted as well. And people do have, like now there's a bit of a stigma. So you should be counseled at least at this stage.
I think mine's also just a comment that it's not necessarily just an equity question of whether or not it should be freely available. It should also be available at multiple locations. Whilst you go back to the HIV stigma, where patients would take numerous tablets, and people could already identify, it's TB or it's HIV. Whereas if it's one pharmacy or one lab that is doing is providing this care, you're going back to the stigma question. You're stigmatizing patients that actually want to get it. So freely available is an equity problem as well as a location problem. You can't expect these people to go to one place because then everyone's going to know that it's a monkeypox case.
But we could put a vaccination station at Beefcakes, don't you think?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And then the last issue is a healthcare worker refuses to care for a monkeypox patient. What do you think about that? What do you think about that, Lucile?
So it's really about understanding the risks to the healthcare worker. And they're really extremely low. Respiratory transmission, transmission from virus in scales is really extremely low. It's direct skin-to-skin contact. And I think for the most part in the healthcare setting, gloves, masks, I think are mostly available. And it's about educating. It really is.
Okay.
I don't think healthcare workers should be allowed to refuse care, because that's in a Hippocratic oath. That's what you're trained to do. So if you are refusing care, then what stops you from refusing to treat someone that has the flu, or something that's not transmissible? You can treat later patients that have cancer because you're not going to be directly affected by it. But that means you can stop treating anyone that shows flu, bronchitis. No, I don't think it should be.
You think you should vaccinate healthcare workers who are dealing with monkeypox patients? So there's a lot of comments. Maybe that one first.
I was just going to say that I think as healthcare workers, we have a responsibility to kind of squash stigma out, right? And healthcare workers are refusing to vaccinate. We're supposed to be educated with that. That's educated. It reinforces the stigma far worse than, I want to say, media campaigns or public uncertainty. I feel like you have a responsibility to educate. If you yourself don't understand what you're doing by reinforcing the stigma. I don't know, I fully agree with Kate.
But we need to educate the health workers about how it's transmitted.
Me. Okay. So I think as much as healthcare workers did take a Hippocratic oath, I think we also have a right to work in a safe environment. So if there isn't any measures in place to protect the healthcare worker, like PPE, like vaccines, I think the healthcare worker is justified to refuse to care for the patient. And so I think that's where the state has a responsibility to ensure that the healthcare worker is best suited up to do their job and take care of patients.
Just to add on what has been said, I also do think that looking back, it also goes back to with COVID and stuff. It also goes back to the location where you are and the availability of the proper PPE around you as the healthcare.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it just goes back to rule makers, in my opinion. So if they handle the education on behalf of the workers, they provide the PPE, the resources, basically, just facilitate the conversation around the community. Then you go back and ask the worker on what basis are you refusing because you've satisfied all your needs. Because that's I think that would actually cause you harm because education, is something we offer you, protection is something we offer you. So now on what basis do you refuse?
I think also you can compare it to other transmissible diseases, like for example TB. Almost all healthcare workers have probably got TB in South Africa, and that's arguably has a higher mortality than something like monkeypox. The monkeypox is maybe got a high morbidity, or it's more prevalent, or not prevalent, it's more visible as such. So you can kind of compare it to other diseases in South Africa that are common.
So currently monkeypox has a low mortality, no deaths in the West, has a moderate morbidity, but it's changing. And the genetic sequences are very important to keep an eye on. It's already different from the West African clade that it's come from. And we don't know what that will do to virulence or transmissibility. So we need to have a little space to monitor that.
Cool. Okay. So I think that's about it. Yeah. Good.
So where are we in South Africa?
Yes. Where are we?
So we have 3 cases, all in males in the age group around 35 to 45. All identify as having had, having sex with men, multiple partners. 2 were acquired locally, but likely had, at the time, because there were a lot of cases in Europe, but not elsewhere, had contact with those who traveled. And the most recent one was a tourist who came to South Africa and presented here, but was infected elsewhere. And all 3 did very well. Contacts were, there was an attempt to do contact tracing and follow up. And it was based on the sort of isolation. So patients were kind of put in isolation, but most had presented quite late. So it was quite late. The one was already, I think, non-infectious by the time he was seen. But contact tracing was really, really difficult. There are many challenges around there, so I don't know the value of it. It's really about informing people. If you've got lesions, sometimes you can't see them, you should reduce your contact with others. But contact tracing by public health authorities, I think, is very, very invasive. And I'm not sure it's the way to go.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's counter.
So why do you think it's just popped up now? Or do you think it's been simmering and we just kind of more aware and we're testing and doing surveillance? I mean, or do you think there's something else that's changed?
So I think, I don't know all the answers. I don't think there were lots of cases before. Remember, some are already quite atypical. There might be 1 or 2 lesions. Patients are not sick. They're diagnosed with other common infections. And access to diagnostics is very limited. So they wouldn't have recognized it, and any medical person may not have recognized it. So I don't think it's been going around a long time. I think what did happen was there were some cases, and then post-COVID, I think a lot of mass gatherings, pride events have really taken place this year. And I think they were amplifying events. I think that's what has happened. I don't think the first cases were made, but I don't think there were lots and lots of others. Don't know, but I don't think so. No, I never know. You have a comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think with these questions about whether medical doctors should be allowed to refuse, I think health actions includes understanding why they want to refuse and educating them about it. So this guy in The Guardian, I read that article as well, Lucile.
Sorry,
the patient in The Guardian.
Oh, that's right,
He
yes.
said he'd suffered greatly and struggled to access care. He said he'd been to Pride and slept with 6 different guys. So I think we should educate everybody. It's not a sexual transmission disease in the sense that it's semen borne or whatever. It's skin-to-skin contact. And if we educate health workers about that, and then about barrier methods, surely, I mean, they handle bed sores with, resistant bugs. Surely we can get past the
I think
why they don't.
It's not easily transmissible.
But we should, I mean, health workers is easy because they're supposed to have the training to understand these things. So, but surely I think there's been a lot of pride, sexual mixing post-COVID, everybody's very explicit about that. We can trace the pride events around the world, and especially around Europe, and how the numbers followed. So we can also put out messaging to those communities without being fear-mongering and stigmatizing. And say, be careful of unprotected sex, and unprotected sex includes skin barriers and stuff. It's not rocket science, we've done this before with other diseases.
Without success.
Very clear to me.
Yeah.
So been a lesion to myself.
Okay, so do you guys want to facilitate some conversation, or are we
Done.
done?
Done.
So, I'd just like to thank our wonderful speakers. We have some questions that were submitted to us on the form. I'm sure you signed up, you saw, and then we also have some online questions. And then from there, if you've got some time, we'll open up to the floor for any more questions. Kate, will take us away.
Okay, so the first question that was posed is, what is the most important thing to tell people who have limited knowledge of medicine regarding the monkeypox threat?
Sure. I think how it's transmitted, I think would be, and what it looks like, but the problem is what it looks like is many other things. And so you create a lot of fears and wrong interventions. I can tell you, just by the way, I spend my time reviewing cases that come to us for monkeypox. Everybody who's done medicine has forgotten everything they learned. So chickenpox is number one. Nobody remembers how to diagnose chickenpox, how to recognize it. And it goes from scabies to drug reactions to everything. So, we can't expect a patient to recognize it. So let's have some answers. It doesn't have to only be to us. What would you tell? The one thing I would make sure, sorry, is there's some awful communications going around before you think, because in Central and West Africa, it's transmitted from animals and then person to person. So it would be bushmeat and then person to person. And I saw a little communication from here that said you mustn't eat meat, you mustn't handle meat with your hands. There is no monkeypox transmitted. It's not endemic here, it doesn't occur naturally, and it cannot be contracted from meat. And on the corner of this awful communication, there was a picture of a T-bone steak with carrots. I mean, what kind of message is that? It's rubbish. It's mixing up there and here and others. Sorry.
I was going to say I can't speak to like the biological aspects, but I think you should tell people not to panic first.
Yeah. So one of the concerns about raising the public health emergency to this level was that it creates fear and panic. It's a mild disease, very few people have died. So it needs to be put into context. I think after COVID, we need to kind of manage this.
Yeah, I mean, 3 cases,
It's a lot more. But so that was one of the criticisms about raising it.
Okay. All right, the next question is, what specific measures in South Africa and in the NICD in particular are they employing to ensure monkeypox does not become a local epidemic?
Okay, well, we do have diagnostics, which I think are very important because you can confirm what is, and you can also exclude what isn't, which is like 99.9% of submissions, considering that clinical diagnostics has become a problem. So I think that's very important. And, confirming if it is allows you to put some interventions in place. I think communications could be better. I think one must involve all appropriate groups. It's often top down and some unfortunate. What else? That's enough on that.
Okay, the next question is, what did the US and other Western countries get wrong in their response to monkeypox, which is resulting in their current case numbers?
So let's hear from you. I think that's a very interesting question. So they did create some panic without being able to respond to the panic. And I think the man who shared his story in The Guardian was a very good example. He couldn't get a diagnosis. There were only 2 or 3 labs. he waited days and days and days for his results. I think some of the vaccine issues and availability, they created expectations but weren't able to meet them. I think that was a problem. But I think it's a difficult disease to contain. I don't think isolation and imposing that is going to stop spread. I think a rational vaccine campaign with adequate vaccines, working together with different groups, is probably a much better way to go. Isolation, I think, is taking resources. It's not going to work. Create stigma. It's not the way to go. It's not peace.
Okay, so the next question.
No, I'm not the only one answering. I have lots of opinions.
The next question is monkeypox similar to measles, and can my measles vaccine offer some protection against monkeypox?
No. So measles is highly infectious. Okay, the reproductive rate is much higher. Chickenpox is very infectious. You don't want to be in the same room with somebody with chickenpox if you haven't had it. And the vaccine does not offer any protection. Smallpox vaccine maybe is what they wanted to say, but no.
Okay, I think these are some ethical questions. Where does the assumption that monkeypox is spread via gay sex stem from?
Via what?
Gay sex.
Well, that's kind of a biological question too, because if you look at the evidence at the moment, predominantly men who have sex with men are affected more than other risk groups. But it's probably, or most certainly, a function of intimate contact that leads to the transmission, and it's most certainly and biologically not related, as Lucile shared, to the actual sexual transmission in bodily fluids. So it is an assumption that has been made on the basis of perhaps reporting of the facts and interpretation by laypersons. However, in the management of outbreaks, it's critically important to listen to what people are saying. So health promotion activities should always include a rapid and assessment and keeping an ear out for misinformation that comes around, so that misinformation can be corrected early on before it becomes entrenched. So this kind of misinformation needs to be included in terms of public health communications to inform people who is actually at risk. And one of the problems with this kind of misinformation is that persons may consider themselves not at risk who actually are, and who otherwise may have taken appropriate actions to protect themselves, but now are not afforded the luxury of choice because they've bought into a misinformed perspective on disease transmission. So listening and adequate communication by health authorities is important. That wasn't really an ethical question.
Is the global public health sector fully equipped with all the resources needed to curb this epidemic? Also, what is at the heart of the WHO not declaring this and giving it the attention it deserves?
So it has declared this. It did take a little bit of time. At the time of the first meeting, there were relatively few cases. At the time of the second meeting, the outbreak had actually plateaued in some of the countries. So I think there wasn't a clear decision. And I think it's an interesting read that all the different opinions have been published. But we don't have the resources. That's one of the intentions of declaring the public health emergency, is to raise the level, to bring, the WHO doesn't provide money, but others do, to stimulate research. There's lots of unknowns, especially about transmission and about efficacy of effectiveness of interventions, lots of unknowns. And then to bring countermeasures, new vaccines that you can produce in large quantities that are safe and effective, new drugs, new diagnostics that are rapid and easier to administer. That's one of the aims of raising, and to do it in a collaborative way.
Okay, which organs does monkeypox attack? We know there's no cure.
There's treatment,
There's
and
treatment.
treatment works quite well. Definitely Very few patients need it. It's self-limiting in the majority. Those who can be hospitalized, particularly those with severe proctitis or rectal lesions, have benefited by tecovirimat, which is not available everywhere, but it does work. Which is the other thing?
Organs.
The organs. So you get secondary infection, you get septicemia, you get a pneumonia, more common in children, pregnant women, and immunocompromised. And I think there have been a couple of cases of encephalitis. But mostly self-limiting skin lesions that get better over about 2 to 3 weeks, which is a long time if you want to isolate socially, especially post-COVID. It's not going to happen.
So the next question is, what is the demographic information on the cases identified in South Africa?
Well, there are only 3 cases, all male, all what? All in the 30s to 40. Yeah.
I've only got 3 more. Considering the severe...
And it's been published, we've shared the information, but we respected the confidentiality.
So considering the severe mistrust of the government regarding SARS-CoV-2 vaccines, what will make the potential rollout of the smallpox vaccine more accepted in a broader non-scientific community?
Okay, so we don't access to vaccines going to take place at the National Advisory Group meeting sometime in August. There's a regulatory pathway, there's availability, but there is discussion. And I think who it will be, how and who and where, and
I think the key thing is understanding the drivers of vaccine hesitancy and addressing communication in a way that allows people to identify what their own reasons for trust, lack of trust in vaccination is. It's a growing field, the public health and behavioral side around vaccine hesitancy. It certainly deserves a lot more attention, and I think the final end common pathway is around strategies and health communication strategies to address underlying lack of trust. So the person who asked the question said lack of trust in the South African government. And it's very interesting that lack of trust in health authorities and governments in general is a predictor of vaccine hesitancy across the world. And we're not unique in that space. And it seems that when lack of trust is present, vaccine uptake is low. And this is an important warning to governments to behave and to uphold principles of human rights, because we can never achieve a public health intervention or deliver it successfully. We can't look after our people if the government doesn't uphold human rights generally at times when it's not necessary or it's not life-threatening. So, no answer,
But a lot of that so-called vaccine hesitancy is people just afraid. They have specific questions they want answered. And if you do it from the bottom, not the top down, and they have an opportunity to ask their questions and you can address the fears, your uptake, irrespective, will be very much better. A lot of people did that during COVID and answered, which are acceptable fears. They could be raised.
So I know you've already given your opinion on lockdown, but the question is, and we had a lot of these questions, is do you think that this declaration of the monkeypox outbreak as an international emergency will spur governments and specifically our government to take any lockdown precautions?
No, it's not going to be a lockdown. Lockdowns are not part of monkeypox. I don't think isolation is the right intervention. Lockdowns are, I think we've moved away from that, and it's inappropriate for monkeypox. It really is.
Okay, my last question. How best can the news about the virus be spread without stigmatizing a certain group of people? like many in the LGBTQ plus community?
I think we've addressed that question. I think an understanding of the biology around disease transmission is key. And it's not necessary to mention, I was going to say it's not necessary to mention risk groups, but on the other hand, one wants to inform people who are members of risk groups that it is in their interests to be more aware of their own risk. So one runs a tension between the two. So again, no answer.
So I was going to say, some of the lockdown and some of the measures were imposed because hospitals were completely overwhelmed. It was trying to just reduce transmission at that time to kind of save the health system. But in terms of reducing actual transmission overall and stopping the pandemic, not clear.
So we have 3 really pertinent questions online here. First is quite actually interesting question. Is it possible for our rodents in this country to be exposed since they are the most likely carrier? And in that case, what does that mean for monkeypox spread in South Africa?
So there's no evidence that our animals are infected with monkeypox. The natural home of endemic monkeypox is equatorial rainforests. And we don't know the reservoirs, but it's that whole equatorial rainforest.
Secondly,
I've learned never say never. And remember the prairie dogs the rodents that were exported to the States, and there was a big outbreak.
yes.
I think this international trade in animals is a major issue.
Then Western countries have recently been offering vaccine to LGBTQ people and communities. Are we doing the same thing here for the cases that we've got? And how prepared are we to, should case numbers increase rapidly, how prepared are we to do such a thing?
So we don't have vaccine at the moment. As I mentioned, the discussions are going to happen. And I think we should have access to vaccine and offer it.
How easy is it to get access to?
So at the moment, the suppliers are being ramped up. Other producers are coming on board. Quickly, the world, it'll be the usual.
Yeah.
Those that pay more, those who are got bigger outbreaks have access. It's an issue. Yeah. But there are discussions, and hopefully we have some positive results.
Awesome, thank you.
But that's a long way off.
Yeah.
Regulatory supplies. It's not a difficult one to administer. Don't need minus 90, 180-degree fridges.
And then the last question is, where does the social responsibility of Big Pharma feature in this discussion? Especially because Big Pharma has, I think, in the past been such a sort of an impedance to healthcare and administering healthcare.
And I think for many emerging diseases, Big Pharma didn't see the right opportunities for them. I think Ebola changed that. And Big Pharma did take on the vaccine. And I think there've been a lot more funding models to manage that. And so I think things are changing. One hopes.
Do you guys have time for just 1 or 2 questions from the audience?
I think so.
Has anybody got any questions or points?
Just adding on to the Big Pharma question, I'm curious. So in terms of increasing productivity and setting up, with regards to the pharma, has there been a situation? I know there were conversations happening with COVID in terms of potentially looking at lifting patents. So when those conversations are happening, is it mostly how hefty is the ethics in the conversation, or is it mostly just about balancing the cost of everything?
Yeah, I think you raise a very important point about patents. And I know the what's that organization? I see the building in Geneva.
The World Trade Organization.
The World Trade Organization has had this big conversation in the last few years, and definitely relates to drug patents and to vaccine patents to allow that to be lifted.
So right now, where's the scale? Is it mostly ethics heavy or is it compensation heavy? Where are we now? Oh, okay.
I just wanted to ask how, if at all, you feel that the COVID process and the rush for COVID vaccines potentially changed the way, like the trial process is done, especially because, and again, limited knowledge, but as far as I'm aware, like in the past, when it comes to getting a vaccine through, and obviously I guess money is a big factor in this, but it takes, generally speaking, the whole process takes a long time. And I guess a big problem with vaccines is everyone is like, this takes forever. How on earth have we done this all in a year? So
it wasn't done in a year.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think Ebola was sentinel disease and sentinel vaccine. So I was a part of a group in 2016. It was just past Ebola, where they had taken this vaccine out of a laboratory and made it into a commercial product and trials it with great success. And that was, I think, a pivotal moment. It was a meeting held to look at emerging diseases, likely diseases that were major outbreaks, particularly in resource-limited countries with a major public health effect, for which there were no countermeasures. And a group of diseases were identified, and a lot was done to try and move this vaccine pathway. And I think that was really, it spoke to Zika, it spoke to coronaviruses were identified as a disease that had this potential, and that countermeasures should start to be made. Drugs, diagnostics, and vaccines. So when COVID did arrive, the vaccine didn't just pop out of the sky. There was a lot already happening. And I think it's those sort of initiatives. It was a WHO one. It's called the R&D blueprint that changed things and brought big pharma,
I think
big pharma to the party.
Also some important context around it. Vaccine development prior to COVID and prior to Ebola really took place in the context of developing a new vaccine formulation. Are we going to mix DTP with Haemophilus vaccine and pneumococcal vaccine, and how well do they work together versus the standard of care? So those were the kind of vaccine trials that were taking, 10 to 15 years. And then there were also vaccines in development for conditions that didn't have the public health significance that COVID had. And, ethics review committees meet once a month, and then, the wheels of science turn slowly. So it wasn't that the vaccine trials for COVID were any less scientifically rigorous. It was just that the mechanisms, the administrative processes to get those trials underway happened a lot faster. And then, as Lucile said, there was a foundation called the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Initiatives, and that was CEPI. And CEPI, in response to the R&D blueprint that was produced by the WHO, developed a vaccine development pipeline. So this was happening from 2010. Different people were trying different vaccines. When I was a medical student in 1994, I did my project, or my colleague did his project on RNA vaccines, DNA vaccines. So they've been around for years. It's just that the immediate urgency and the application didn't happen. So CEPI developed a number of what they call backbones. So the MVA, modified vaccinia ankara, is a replicating vaccinia virus, or it's a non-replicating vaccinia virus, into which a piece of DNA can be transcribed that can allow the body to replicate the protein. That had been done already. And so it was just a matter, as Lynn said, of putting in the spike protein for SARS-CoV-2 as soon as the sequence was available. So the misconceptions around vaccine development were enormous and then fueled conspiracy theories.
But you can do trials during outbreaks. I think Ebola vaccine showed that. You can work with regulatory authorities to get things speeded up. You can have private-public partnerships to provide them resources. It is possible. And you've got great new technology, and you can use platforms that exist from this great new technology to kind of react to new pathogens. Yeah.
Just to wrap things up,
Yes.
can I ask you guys very quickly, what can we do as future healthcare professionals to help?
Help what?
To help the state of monkeypox in South Africa and the world.
Communications, sharing facts. I think communication is incredibly important.
Particularly on social media.
Yeah. We don't want T-bone steak.
Well, I'd like to thank you guys very much. I'd like to thank our committee members for helping us set up this event. I'd like to thank our fantastic audience, you guys. And most importantly, again, I'd like to thank our brilliant speakers, Dr. Lucile Blumberg, Dr. Kerrigan McCarthy. We have got gifts for you if you wouldn't mind accepting these tokens of our appreciation. Thank you very much for joining us today. I think it's been an incredibly informative talk, incredibly important talk, a very well-timed talk.
Yeah,
and we are so grateful to join the Vid Students Bioethics Society. Now that we are finishing up, just for everybody, there is our refreshments upstairs in the foyer if anybody would like to go and get some. And we will be providing resources at a later stage if anyone wants to help get involved in any way. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
You did too.
Preparing it.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. Thanks, everybody.
Food for thought.
Industry.
Thank you so much.